Is there anything I should say to start? I was wondering, what in the heck does he mean by faith? But that's kind of the second half of the reading. Like when he uses the word faith, it's not anything I recognize as fitting for that word. So that's a big question I've got. And then he, at one point, I don't know if he says, well, clearly we've been talking about religion for the last few pages. And I'm like, what? I don't remember there being anything about religion there. So anyway, I don't know what he means by religion, and I don't know what he means by faith. And then, earlier in the text, another, the first part of the reading is, I have lots of questions as always, but I'm having a hard time kind of understanding what he means by wealth and why it is so damn important. What exactly is wealth? Because wealth is like this manifestation of spirit, and it has all these philosophical and ontological implications, it seems, and I don't really understand what he's doing with that. So I guess if the two big words that there's again a bunch of them, but like, what does he mean by wealth and what's he doing with that? And what does he mean by faith and what's he doing with that?
Just as like brief as possible, because it is a very brief answer. Wealth is state power when it confronts a. Can you hear me, by the way? Do I sound good? Okay, great. He defines it as state power confronting a will that wants to seize control of it. Wealth is state power confronting a will that wants to seize control of it. It's in that sense, it allows, it's part of the transformation of noble consciousness into base consciousness, where the noble consciousness, and you can, and I don't know if this is naive of me, maybe, but a part of me does kind of just imagine this in a sort of sequence of events as I'm reading sometimes, honestly. And I guess that, which I guess is implied by the sequential order within which, these things are kind of unraveled. But I imagine, for the sake of my understanding of the concept, the idea of a noble consciousness, and I think of like a noble person, I guess, ascending to power, or seeing the relationship between self-sacrifice and power, seeing like the necessary relationship between self-sacrifice and power, and accepting the cost of purchasing power. And the noble consciousness is becoming this base consciousness as soon as it does that, as soon as it gets into this mode of being like a member of the political body, like the government, the simple self of the ethical substance and the ethical life. But it transforms into this base consciousness. And the way that he describes its action in doing that is sublating universal substance, subordinating universal power to being for itself. And I think that fits within my concept of what wealth does, you know what I mean? And it made more sense when he said, okay, wealth is state power confronting a will that wants to seize control of it. I could find a page, in fact, where he does it, but I guess, yeah, that's where I found him to give like a pretty like concise definition of it, but like it does a lot of things. I'll agree there. It's on page 299. It's on page 299. I think it's, oh yes, 514 and 515 to kind of explain what I'm saying here. Section 514 and section 515 on page 299. That's what I mean. It does a lot of things as it kind of interacts with the consciousness, that the will that wants to seize control of it. But that's just an answer as to what it is, I guess. But to go on would be to talk, I guess, just talk through like the rest of the chapter, you know what I mean? But yeah, that's my answer on wealth. Somebody else do the other one.
I feel like I could make a comment on, I think I know what you were referring to, Nevitt, when you said like, oh, we've been talking about religion these past few pages. I'm thinking of where he said, maybe I'm looking at page 308, 527. He says, just as religion, for it is clear that it is religion that is being spoken of. I think he means that, like, particularly here, he's talking about, like, faith is a way that religion comes on the scene, but that it's come on the scene beforehand as well as unhappy consciousness. I don't think he's necessarily, like, talking about religion and faith before that, but how I think faith kind of comes out of this, like, witty consciousness. Like, that's like the kind of, like, development that it leads to. And when I, like, my attempt at a simple idea of what he means by faith is that from out of that kind of, like, witty consciousness, it splits into, like, what was earlier, like we talked about it last week, I think, when we were talking about pure consciousness. And I remember, Neva, you were just like, what is pure consciousness? What is pure consciousness? I feel like I had a vague idea about it then, but I feel like he's definitely developing it here, where we get into, like, faith and insight are like two sides of pure consciousness, and they're both kind of like confronting and relating to the world, but maybe in, like, this, like, negative fashion. Whereas faith wants to construct, like, an object, kind of like, I imagine, like, this is like the heavenly realm, and it's like a still object. Insight wants to, like, turn everything into concept, into, like, restless motion. And so I think like, my rough understanding is just like faith opposes insight, and both of them are kind of, like, developed out of the actual world, but they see themselves as, like, negating the actual world.
Yeah, some solid points there, Joey. I agree with pretty much everything you just said. In order to answer the question, where is faith, we kind of have to go backwards to where he separates pure consciousness from actual consciousness. And I think all along, pure consciousness never fully separates from actual consciousness, but is shown to have been always and all along an outgrowth from actual consciousness, right? But pure consciousness takes the otherworldly as its object, and that's what differentiates it from actual consciousness, right? And in its taking the otherworldly as its object, it then kind of opposes itself to the actual and creates its own dynamic, where faith is later in this reading kind of further investigated as being something more concerned with the in itself of the ethical substance, which is, through pure consciousness, posing an otherworldly, but where, again, where does this positing come from, right? And then insight is kind of a reversal of that. It reminds me of the section early on forces and understanding, I want to say, where, you take these truths you get from postulating the otherworldly and then turn them back onto the actual, from which it always originally came, but you find truths of ethical life through that process, right? A kind of reversal of flights away from the material, right? If that makes sense, if that helps answer the question of what faith is. And similarly with the question of wealth, and agree with a lot of the points that Hunter was making. I want to say he did wealth in the section above 514. He says wealth is state power in its own self through its own willing, which clings to itself as it confronts a will that wants to seize control. So I want to say, early on in this ethical substance, he kind of splits up state and wealth, state power and wealth power, only to bring them back together again. And anyway, that's, it's all under the auspice of ethical substance, right? We're not looking at state power or wealth as they are as, like, objective, purely valueless social entities at all. They are. This is all within the species of ethical life. Aspects of it being differentiated and then recombined.
So I guess, looking at that 514, maybe it should be more obvious to me than it is, but I'm still not sure what that means. So wealth, what Eric just read, is state power in its own self through its own willing, which clings to itself as it confronts a will that wants to seize control of it for its own activities of consumption. So I'm trying to think of that in sort of more concrete terms. So you've got state power that in its own self, its own willing. So it wants to cling to itself, I guess, maintain its coherence and its own power in confrontation with some opposing force. Well, and I'm wondering, what is that opposing? I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it there, but a will that wants to seize control of it for its own activities of consumption. So there's something else that wants to consume what? The state, or wrest power from the state? Or I'm just trying to figure out what that, what does that dense sentence mean? It seems very abstract to me. And is like is he just bouncing like concepts around in his head, or is he thinking of like historical kind of instances, or what's he thinking?
I'm trying to like get an idea of the context of this particular page. I don't remember if he's like introduced base yet, or if we're still like in the noble, talking about kind of like giving the monarch his self. But to me, wealth is kind of situated in that transition of like the noble who's flattering the monarch, which kind of like gives selfhood to the state power as in itself. And so when I read that, state power is an own self. And the sentence before that, it says, it is not the universal of state power, utterly devoid of a self. So I read that as like, this is like kind of like something the monarch is stepping into when he gets flattered, and he has the opportunity to like reward flattery through like a giving of wealth to like the nobles. And then this kind of like transitions to the next stage where he's no longer like just upholding state power, but he's like, and when I see it confronts a will that wants to seize control of it for its own activities of consumption, I think of like the noble who's the noble who's like alienated from their self and is flattering this monarch, wants like to receive like substance in itself from the monarch. And the monarch's like sees its, like when I imagine the monarch as a kind of like supposedly embodiment of state power, has the power to like give substance and in itself to the flattering noble. And he does that through wealth. And I imagine noble as the self that wants to seize control of its own, of the monarch's own activities for consumption. But I think like this is part of what, like, and I'm looking on page 298 where he gets to saying something about the monarch coming to be just an empty name, which reminded me of what Hunter was talking about last night, how like the monarch just ends up being a dummy, just an idiot who stands in a place. And I think that's like what we see happen here, that the monarch, in like recognizing himself as also just a self and not just state power, and like he just kind of has this like wealth to give to people, and it's like he's like, right, it says it clings to itself, like it's like trying to like hold on to the idea that like I am the person who gives wealth. I'm not just an empty name, even though at this point I think he has become an empty name. And I want to say that like that becoming empty, like going through state powers becoming wealth, kind of transitions us into like base consciousness. I guess I do like wonder, and again, like I feel like maybe the context would help, which I'm not getting. But when he talks about wealth needing to be further developed or needing to be enlivened, and how that works itself out in the next couple of pages, which I think is how we get to base consciousness.
On a completely unrelated note, your new glasses are very handsome. I like the blue.
Thank you. I think I do have, I'm assuming you're talking to me.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I do have like multiple pairs of glasses, and I actually exchange them out. So these aren't super new, but maybe I just.
Well, they're awesome. They look great.
I'm flattered. Send you some PSN gift cards.
That kind of makes sense. I'd like to know what other people think about, Joey's analysis. I just noticed at the bottom of 298 at 513, he says, enriched in this way, which I don't want to go back and see what that means, but enriched in this way by the universal power, self-consciousness exists as universal beneficence, or universal power is wealth, which is again itself an object for consciousness. So that seems to kind of fit with what Joey was saying, that if universal power is wealth, then in 513, someone else or some other person or something else wants to appropriate that for its own purposes. That seemed to be what Joey was saying, and maybe that's the noble consciousness in relation to the monarch. I guess another question I have, Hunter mentioned that, I don't remember how you put it, but is it that the noble consciousness somehow devolves into the base consciousness? And I noticed in 512, the first sentence, he mentions noble consciousness. In the last sentence of 512, he mentions the base consciousness that has achieved its end, that of subordinating universal power to being for itself. And so I'm wondering, what is the relationship between noble consciousness and base consciousness, and what is their respective relationship to wealth, that we've been talking about? Like Joey was saying, that this other thing tries to appropriate power. So I don't know if Hunter or someone wants to talk about the base consciousness in relation to noble consciousness and how they're related to wealth.
But I also would like to ask Hunter as well, because in 521, the thing that stuck out the most to me is that he said it is the absolute and universal inversion in the alienation of the actual world of thought. It is pure culture. And throughout 521, when he's talking about the noble consciousness, he says the noble consciousness is ignorable and repudiated, just as the repudiated consciousness changes around into the nobility, which characterizes the most highly developed freedom of self-consciousness. So in 521, it's almost like he's saying that pure culture is like a division between life and thought, and that in a way, when he says that it's later on in 521, where he says, when I just read, where it's like, it characterizes, when he mentions the noble consciousness, the most highly developed freedom of self-consciousness, it's almost like he's saying that the noble consciousness is a synthetic version of what he later calls pure consciousness. Like it finds a way not to go back into itself and find something higher, but considering itself as the being in itself and for itself, which in a way is not the pure consciousness, but is a synthetic one, which was what I was getting out of the 521, 522 readings. And if that was accurate in regards to the noble consciousness. Mainly the division of life and thought. Kalkovich calls it actuality and essence. But when I read that, I think it's almost like it's, again, that synthetic self-consciousness that is in its way a form of pure consciousness, and that we can kind of see through the dialectical process of pure culture, which does separate it, how to get into pure consciousness, if that's a good way to interpret it.
Well, I guess just what all that makes me think, I guess, just to try and, I want to say, Nevit, this is not a one-to-one sort of consistent source for analogizing towards this progress of these concepts. But for this particular stage, the notion of wealth being that the state power in its own will, trying to preserve itself, but also confronting these people. The way that I one of the first examples that I just thought to myself that kind of work, but that is, makes sense to me, is like when the United States was being founded, and it was a series of colonies that had a number of different currencies that caused the very severe logistical problems in intercolonial trade on the continent. And then it's, and this is all I read. This is from Howard Zinn, I think was his name. Yeah, People's History of the United States. Pretty good book. I read it a long time ago though. And the point is, it's just a basic metaphor of like a federal government coming in and saying, we are going to mint all the money, and it's going to come from us, and you're going to have to report back to us with that money, and it's illegal to tear it up. And, you know, and in that way, that government, that governing body, by sort of minting a currency, expresses itself in its own will in response to other wills which seek to seize its power for their own activities of consumption. And it maintains itself through that in the form of the wealth that is present within the society to be circulating, to be, but you know, the problem, I guess, is that I think it's, you know, capital kind of operates in a much different way. You know what I mean? Like actual minted currency and like at that time, I guess, but like in the long run, but you get kind of the idea, just the picture. And that's, so aside from that, the noble consciousness to the base consciousness, that was the other thing. Okay. I think that, yeah, I don't know what Hegel would think of Bitcoin, Jackson, sorry, but I think that the relationship between the notion of the noble consciousness and the base consciousness, it's both, yes, there's like Nevitt, you pointed out at the beginning of that section, he's talking about the noble consciousness and the base, and the base consciousness, I think, is when the noble consciousness it relates to power in the way that it does, this relationship to the monarch, in this relationship of flattery, you know, flattery and silence and obedience, and then relating to it as this will to seize, you know, this will that waits to seize control of it, this, which is, you know, what those wills shall do, as they have done up to the point that they are at now, through their acts of self-relinquishing for the sake of actualizing their doing. They relinquish themselves for the sake of the actualization of purpose.
What do you mean by that, by saying they relinquish themselves?
Well, well, that's how they become like a noble. Like they, at least in theory, there is some degree to which any theoretical noble consciousness would have to commit themselves in a self-relinquishing act, like
See, what are you, do you just mean, I mean, the sense I got, and is this,
yes, sure,
is it just that the impression I got was that in the noble consciousness, they take the interests of others as important, basically, rather than just being completely self-absorbed in their own individual projects, that they accept a broader social role? Is it that simple, or is that, oh, Eric says no.
I'm curious where you got that.
I would have to go back and look in the text, but I just thought there was something about the noble consciousness being noble because it had relinquished some of its individuality. Like, I mean, this is probably not adequate, but like on the top of 297, the noble consciousness empties itself of the pure in itself of its thinking, its I. In the name of this, in the name, the singular individual counts as a pure individual, no longer only his own consciousness, but in the consciousness of all.
Right.
So it was in that kind of stuff that I was thinking.
I can see, so because I'm looking at it differently. It was, for me, the all, the empty, and I think that, the relinquishment that Hunter's hinting at is not other people, per se. I want to take it back. Hegel separates pure consciousness from actual consciousness and finds wealth and state power to be apparently opposed elements of the actual ethical substance, which we discover are not quite as opposed as we had imagined them to be. On the other side, we have pure consciousness, which splits up ethical substance between good and bad. Right now, then he goes to define the noble consciousness as the one who meets both wealth and power and identifies with them and sees them as good. And then the coarse consciousness, or the base consciousness, is the one that looks at wealth and power and says these are bad. I remember at the beginning of the last seminar, I was like, oh, I learned today that Hegel thinks I'm not a base consciousness, right? Because I've got this inclination to criticize wealth and the power of wealth as well as the power of the state, right? And in his, the way he bifurcates the power of wealth and the power of the state kind of fits with pictures that that I've gotten anyway of ancient Greek society, where they had state power and they had very wealthy people, and they went through periods where sometimes the very wealthy people basically controlled the cities, and then other times the cities kind of wrested democratic power, or they put all of their faith behind a tyrant, but so that they could wrest power away from the wealthy nobles. So I want to say that in ancient Greek society, it was kind of more of an apparent dynamic, the power of the state versus the power of the wealth. Although again, all along these were never fully separated, and we can see already with the Romans, and imagine Caesar being stamped on the coin. I'm glad you brought that up, Hunter, because controlling currency is one of the main ways that state power exerts itself in the sphere of wealth. And we see that right through to, even today we have apparent contradictions between state power and wealth power, but we also have an underlying unity in that state power exerts itself through control of currency and property rights and all of that. And Nietzsche's objecting. That was most of what I had to say.
I'm looking at page 300 and still trying to kind of connect noble to base consciousness and how we get to be emphasizing the base. For me, 300 looks like where he talks about noble kind of like recognizing, or like I'm seeing him talk about base consciousness in section 518. And what I'm recalling is that once state power shifts over into wealth, and I think what wealth does is it kind of like alienates further the noble consciousness's sense of like receiving itself back. Like maybe there was a kind of illusion that it was receiving some sort of substance or self back from the monarch when it was state power. But I think wealth further makes its like sought after object like an object, as opposed to like seeking itself through a subject, through a monarch. I think when it becomes wealth, it becomes more of an object, which further alienates like the noble consciousness, and then it just like kind of all falls through into base consciousness, where you just like lose respect for both of them. And I'm associating base consciousness and like what Eric said, like it's like you see wealth and state power is kind of just like not good. And you kind of have this disdain. You're not grateful, but you like depend on it at the same time. And I feel like this is what I took him to be talking about, like on 519, where he gets into this like different kind of language, the language of disruption. And in Calcavage, the secondary source, he refers to Ramu's nephew, which I think a lot of these quotes are from Ramu's nephew, which is in general like this story about like what we might say a noble consciousness is, like having a conversation with someone known as like a base consciousness. So and the base consciousness person is kind of just like, you know, he's very witty, and he just kind of like, he says everything and also just like invalidates himself all the time. And he's just like not impressed. He's just like, you could say he's cultured, but he's like just disenchanted with his own enculturation.
I mean, that kind of, so what that makes me think, you know, I read that business before where the noble consciousness, I want to say, relinquishes some of his individuality. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but I mean, that kind of fits with what you guys are saying, because, you know, maybe the general thing is that the noble consciousness recognizes its essential place within the you know, the economy of the state, whereas the base consciousness tries to reject that while having to rely on it at the same time. And so, you know, like last time I was talking about how, you know, Hegel's trying to show how universality and individuality are essentially connected or the same or something, I don't know what. But then that's one reason why the monarch sits up at the top, because there you have literally the individual human being who is at the same time a manifestation of state power. So you have the individual and universal, you know, the individual human being being the representative and manifestation of universal state or more universal state power. And then maybe the noble consciousness then is part of that system, and recognizes and engages itself as part of that system, whereas the base consciousness is sort of trying to pull away and extract itself away from that movement that Hegel seems to think is sort of inevitable of things, you know, of this increasing merging between individual and universality. And I mean, you know, we talked about last time whether that's really true or not, but I was thinking, it seems like maybe this is too much of a red herring, but most human political organizations do have at least some individual who is kind of an executive. So even, you know, the United States has the president that's executive, you know, Britain has the prime minister. So even, you know, socialist and democratic states, there's at least one person that kind of has this executive function. And maybe the power is less focused and concentrated in some of those organizations than it is in a monarchy, but nevertheless, it seems to be something we just do. And so I don't know, but I'm wondering, because you know, it seems like Hegel thinks that this whole dialectical thing is just the way the world works. You know, it's not like him trying to, I mean, I think people disagree. You know, people would say, well, you're reading that dialectic into places where there isn't really any, but I get the sense that Hegel's saying, no, this is the way the world works. And this is one place where you see this dialectical process moving in that direction of merging universality and individuality. And that maybe Hegel would say that's why we almost always have at least, you know, some kind of individual that has at least a big chunk of state power or political power.
I think that a good way to kind of just, I don't know, illustrate my thoughts on that, and then kind of there's a lot of stuff, I guess, from this section that I could kind of respond to that we were talking about, but whatever. I think that the way that I see it, it's like, as far as my reading of Hegel has gotten me, and the other readings that I've encountered through secondary sources, not all of them, certainly not all of them, but a lot of them would argue, and I can, you know, I would say that I find this to be relatively reasonable, that, and I don't know yet because we haven't finished the book, I guess I can't technically say anything for sure, but I will someday. I will be able to say it confidently without this clarifier. But I feel like there's this pattern in the book or within the text, within the work, to follow the pattern that you're describing, Nevitt. This sort of merging of individuality and universality. Because, and this is something that even Gadamer says, a very, very, very traditional reader of Hegel. When he says, like, you know, Hegel's basic opinion on the ancient world is that their mission was to universalize the actual, to take the actual man, the citizen of Rome or whatever, and to educate him into a universal subject, or an educated, universally valid or universally capable or whatever, you just universally minded, universally thinking being. From this position as an actual person. And then this is Gadamer saying, I think Hegel is trying to do the opposite, is trying to actualize the universal. And what that means, he's like, that's kind of up for debate, but that's at least something that he's definitely getting into there at the, you know, even from the preface onward. So I'm saying, I definitely see what you're saying about the movement of individuality and universality, and they're coming together. You know what I mean? But at the same time, I guess it's sort of like, it's like you have these terms, you call them terms. If we want to imagine like if I was Bertrand Russell and I was trying to imagine what Hegel was like, I guess I would imagine terms kind of growing towards each other through a series of dialectical patterns, that they, you know, terms jumping across relationships between one another within the sphere of actuality, governed by at least some margin of the actual realm's, you know, limitations or abbreviations on options or possibilities, you know what I'm saying? And saying, okay, they're actualizing these dialectical paths up towards this culminating point, this like omega point, this theoretical, like, that's X-Men, by the way, that's from, never mind. This theoretical like end of the process of like the ultimate reconciliation or unification, true unification of universality and particularity, or of, I guess, absolute, just the state of absolute known, or the absolute idea, you know what I mean? Would be just like it sounds, you know? But I think that if I could, you know, I guess, replace that visual of it like a tree kind of culminating in some like, you know, well, I guess like a backwards tree, I guess. like a tree growing in reverse. Never mind. That's just trying to make it confusing now. I'm just trying to make like trying to lead you off the trail. No, I would say that I think there's this circularity, but this weird like differential circularity, not in the way that I think that Deleuze talks about a spiral, you know, which I know that I've read that he does, you know, not the repetition of the same, but the repetition of difference, you know what I mean? I think that it's not, yeah, it's not quite like a spiral, but it's also not this like ascending like culmination. I think it's like whatever, I don't know, Chase. I'm just whatever, but it's like a Mobius strip, you know, this series of terms that we encounter, and as soon as they are encountered terms, you know, always already having been so, they are de facto like moving in this way, like you're saying, Nevitt. This is just him. I feel like this is him trying to be descriptive, or at the very least, also trying to take like responsibility for the fact that it's like, yeah, you could see all this in a very different way. You know what I mean? Like you could justify these things or explain these things to yourself in a very different way from the way that I'm doing it. But from the position that I am doing it, I am trying to take full account of the position from which I'm doing it. And from this position of trying to gesture past where Kant said was impossible, totally emptying out all the categories of what it means to be a subject and desubstantialize the subject and so on. I feel like he's saying that, like, all of these things, when we engage in this mode, will behave this way, and it can be observed to some degree, I guess, within our personal experience. Like, we can say, like, oh yeah, there are these practical examples, or these pieces of literature, or these expressions of this idea in art, or I know I can see this pattern that he's described through political action or whatever, but it's not necessarily what I think he is describing as is a problem of pure insight way later on, which is this state of being purely rational and insisting that everybody else be purely rational. Be what you are in yourself, be rational, you know what I mean? I think that he's not trying to tell everybody, like, everybody should do the dialectic all the time. Everybody needs to be constantly thinking about everything in the form of the dialectic all the time. Because I think that that's in line with this aspect of pure consciousness, which beseeches people in this. It's this simple spiritual substance that sees pure equality and beseeches everybody to be rational, which is why I don't. And this is a long line of him of example. This is like part of a long line of examples of him kind of really trying to put a lid on the simple spiritual unity and universality and equality. Yes, I know I'm jumping ahead to the end, but I think that's coming from a place of what he says here, which is this is coming back to what Joseph said about the noble and the base consciousness. And this is what I originally wanted to say about the noble and the base consciousness, but oh my God, it all just came back to me. There's a point that Joseph was bringing up. I think it is, I'll go to the page. It would be like the language of disruption and being for itself. Yeah, so pages 302 and 303. Sections 520 and 521. I think that what I got from those parts, what I got from this section, is kind of part of what I'm trying to say here, is that there's this deceit that is uncovered, or supposedly uncovered, you know what I mean, from the perspective of the consciousness of inversion. And so noble consciousness is a commitment to something, is a commitment to this self-relinquishing of universal thinking, or of the universality of thinking, for access to actual universality, you know what I mean? And for wealth and power, for the sake of wealth and power, for its own sake, and then for the seizing of it, also for its sake and your sake, this noble sort of feedback. Sections 520 and 521. But he describes here in these passages this language of disruption that Joey was talking about, that I think is really important, this language of disruption as this perfected language of cultural formation. That's at least one definition he gives of it. He then kind of, I think, to me, reorients it and says this is like judgment, or in a way infinite judgment, this language of disruption that we're speaking, in the sense that consciousness is a disruption. It starts to speak the language of disruption, right? And thus it feels itself. This is not exactly what he's saying, but it's, how I feel, whatever. It's a way to make sense of it, I suppose, to me. And it's like consciousness is he is actually saying that consciousness is a disruption, is this absolute disruption. And in this mode of the language of disruption, and it would seem like it's the perfected language of cultural formation, the most true language possible to what it means to be this disruption. I can speak the language of disruption, you know what I mean? But he says, okay, in this sense, it seems to be able to join subject and predicate, this infinite judgment, this unity of the universal and the particular, you know what I mean? But the problem is this absolute estrangement that comes up where the subject and the predicate are utterly different. And this is coming back to what you and I talked about recently, Nevitt, is like that split between the subject and predicate as object and subject. And he says here, the subject and predicate are utterly different, and being has like being for its object, just as an example. So spirit is the actual world of cultural formation, right? It's the battleground of all of this happening. But the being for itself, or I guess the spirit being the actual world of cultural formation means that spirit has to exist in some actual sense. It has to have some actual presence, some sort of, you know what I mean? Spirit, if it's the actual world of cultural formation, that the next logical thing you'd have to assume is that it has some sort of actual being or existence. And he defines it as being for itself, existing for itself. That's the existence of spirit for him. And that's, don't have to memorize that, but being for itself, existing for itself, if you think it kind of makes sense. But another way to, I guess, kind of approach it for him in this section is through the notion of the consciousness of inversion, which brings the thoughts that are opposed in this subject and predicate, and this nobility and baseness, and this wealth and power, this wealth and state power, this good and this bad. There's this orientation amidst the existence of spirit that is the consciousness of inversion, which brings the thoughts together in absolute inversion, which is still in line with this speaking the language of disruption. You know what I mean? But what that implies, if we take that seriously, what that implies, and he points this out, what it implies is that all of its speaking and judging, i.e. particular acts, must then be in some sense an act of deception. If it's convinced that through this world of absolute inversion that everything is unified and connected, right? If this consciousness is self-convinced, this consciousness of inversion is convinced that the thoughts can come together in absolute inversion, then for it to speak and judge, which is to engage particularly, you know what I mean? It has to then, that speaking and that judging has to be this like conscious act of deception to the whole world, like knowing that that there's this universality of absolute inversion that is then being denied in its speaking and its judging. You know what I'm saying? And the greatest truth that's possible is stating this deceit. I think that that's like the punchline at the end of the paragraph to me, is like this, there's no, I guess the greatest truth possible that's even possible for this is once again an inversion. It's just, oh, it can actually be true. You know what I mean?
So what exactly is the inversion, and why is it necessary? Why does it necessarily arise?
And I think this kind of goes with what Hunter is saying, that kind of goes into what we're talking about in section 523, where he talks about the simple consciousness of the true and good, and then the self-conscious eloquence of the educated mind. And the part I had highlighted in that part is about a little bit further down in 523, where he says, the latter mind, which perverts in its speech all that is unequivocal because of what is self-identical, is only an abstraction, but in its actual existence is its own self a perversion, which I thought was really interesting, because when you read further down, he goes on further to saying, in making the opposite of the noble and good into the condition and the necessity of the noble and good. So it's almost like when the base consciousness has this actuality through speech of what is good and what is bad to it, it's an abstraction, and that abstraction puts conditions on making the opposite of good a conditional, and it's only possible through speech. And that abstraction, or that awareness of the base or simple consciousness through speech, to be frustrated and come to the realization that these really are two sides of the same coin, is what I think what he's saying is part of the dialectical consciousness. So like the simple consciousness is just going to be, I have a concept of good and bad, and where did I have this over here? And what, but by merely saying what is good and bad, you're putting this conditional necessity on it. It's just an abstraction of it, which I thought was a very interesting point on language in and of itself. I'm sorry, my phone's ringing. Get that. Is that what you were saying in section 523, Hunter, about like the statements of what's good and bad having a form of abstraction? Because that's what I was kind of reading into a little bit of what you were talking about.
Well, yeah, I think that I could go into this at a different time, but there is a part, I believe that I think that he would say that like abstraction is, actually, I guess this is in line with what you're saying, is like abstraction as such is like a feature of the thing. Abstraction is a feature of the like world as, you know, imminently as we can possibly kind of conceive of it or relate to it. There's this element of abstraction. And that, to him, another way to think of that is negativity, abstract negativity, you know, madness and war and things like that, barbarism. But there's a point I wanted to make about why do things invert? And I think that it's best handled, or at least the place that we're in right now. The reason that there's all this inversion going on right now is because we're in a particular place in the, you know, in the line of reasoning. And right before where we were just discussing, there was a section 516 on page 299. Section 516 on page 299, I think, kind of posits this element of what's going on later on in pages, in like page 300 and 301, where they're talking about consciousness as absolute disruption. So he says in 516, self-consciousness can abstract from every singular aspect, and for that reason it retains its recognition and validity in itself as the essence existing for itself, even in an obligation which concerns only one of those aspects. However, here it sees itself from the side of its own most pure actuality, where it sees I as external to itself and as belonging to an other, and it sees its personality as such dependent on the contingent personality of an other, dependent on the contingency of a moment, on arbitrary choice, or dependent on some otherwise utterly irrelevant circumstance. In the state of legality, what is within the authority of the objective essence appears as a contingent content, which can be abstracted away from, and the authority does not concern the self as such. Rather, this self is instead recognized as a self. However, the self here sees the certainty of itself as such a certainty that that is the most essenceless, as the pure personality, absolutely devoid of personality. The spirit of its gratitude is thus the feeling of how this deepest abjectness is also the deepest indignation. While the pure I itself intuits itself as external to itself and is disrupted, it is in this disruption that everything which has continuity and universality, everything which is called law, good, and right has come undone and met its downfall. All equality has been dissolved, for what is present is the purest inequality and the absolute inessentiality, the absolute essential of the being external to itself, of being for itself. The pure I itself has been absolutely subverted. So this position of, sorry for reading all of that, I just didn't know how else to kind of say that all. I think the point, or the big points that I think I can take away from that is that like self-consciousness can abstract, or can abstract. I don't know why I keep saying it with that inflection. Self-consciousness can abstract from particularity, any particularity. All right, it has on one hand. So it knows its particular, oh, you know, I'm these contingent materials around me, these contingent factors to my face or my body or whatever, you know, I can abstract myself. I can enter into this sort of like Zen-like state almost, you know what I mean? Or this subjectless awareness, potentially. I can at least conceive of that. And it sees the I as belonging to the other. It sees the I as belonging to an other, and it's being for itself as being for others, and seeing itself subverted as being this noble consciousness under an alien authority, which it also depends on in order to have will. This is the state where the noble consciousness recognizes, while it's accumulating wealth, or while it's flattering while it's flattering the monarch, it sees itself as being under an alien authority. This is a big part of its transition to the base consciousness. You know what I'm saying? And at the same time as recognizing itself as being under this alien authority, it also recognizes that it depends on that alien authority in order to have its will in actualizing its purpose, whatever purposes that is, personal activities of consumption or production or whatever. So the other point of that thing, though it sees abstract, it can abstract from particularity, and it sees its I as belonging to the other. So the I is gone, and all the particularities are gone, and so it's caught in a state of pure inequality. And in pure inequality, the way out that I think that not the way out, but the sort of ensuing movement, at least in 517 and onward, that I see, is him saying that this state of pure inequality, this state of conscious pure inequality, sublates itself, but as pure inequality can sublate its self-sublation for itself, and then kind of reinstantiate itself in this weird way, which I think can start to be something like a base consciousness. You know what I'm saying? But that's its ground. What do you think?
I just wanted to ask a question. Like when you say the sublation of the self-sublation, is that kind of what we're getting later on in the paragraph that Joseph is drawing our attention to, 523, when he talks about like this consciousness like can't really even like completely critique itself or like outwit itself. And the example Kalkovich gives is like this Ramu's nephew in the book, where he's being all witty and all base, and he's like hating on wealth and state power and just making like life look pathetic, makes himself look pathetic. At the end of the book, Kalkovich referenced him being like, all right, well, I'm off to the opera. See you later. I'm wondering if that at all is related to this sublation of self-sublation that you're talking about. And then again, I'm thinking into section 523 on page 305, where he's like, Diogenes in his barrel is conditioned by it. And he's talking about how like to demand this of the individuals, to demand exactly what counts as the bad, namely to demand that he care for himself as a singular individual. However, if the demand to withdraw is directed at universal individuality, it cannot mean that reason must again give up the spiritually and culturally formed consciousness that it has reached, or that reason should let the vast wealth of its moments fall back down again into the simplicity of the natural heart and regress once more into the backwoods and proximity of the animal consciousness, which is called nature. I guess I'm just wondering if you had a more, like, if we see this sublation of self-sublation showing up, and like how that, if you could just like clarify that, or if you know.
Well, I mean, I think I can. Well, it's just what it makes me think of, I guess, is like the sublation of self-sublation that's going on. I think is like this. Yeah, it's this sort of reinstantiating itself, but as this, it recognizes itself in spirit as this absolute disruption, but I think what stabilizes it is that other consciousnesses as absolute disruption can, in communication, can affirm and recognize one another, and in this affirming and recognizing of one another, they're still in this state of having like sublated their self-sublation for themselves in this sort of paradoxical relationship of being an absolutely disruptive affirmation with another person. You know what I mean? This kind of paradoxical relationship, absolutely affirmative relationship with this absolutely disruptive mutual dynamic. And then that then is shattered by wealth as the agent of inequality, i.e. disruption, and it leads the individual towards this inward abyss. Sees himself as this superficiality forsaken for spirit, and then self-consciousness opposes wealth by flattering what it's lost, you know. But all this is to say that I think that sort of sublation of self-sublation, I think that another conundrum is faced, similar to that problem, that weird paradoxical relationship of being in an affirmative relationship to a mutual, in a mutually disruptive yet affirmative and recognition oriented dynamic with another consciousness, right? That paradoxical relationship. There's another paradoxical relationship that enters when we bring up deceit, that I think is like the strong parallel that I think at least I think of when you said what you did, Joey. And it's when he's in this paradoxical point of all of its speaking and judging must then be deception, and the greatest truth then is stating this deceit, you know, is like enunciating its position as the deceit of what it's kind of like, it's like saying this, like, what is it, like the true or false question, this statement is false, you know what I mean? It's kind of like that. It's like, well, I don't, but the motionless consciousness is this sublation of that self-sublation, this reintroduction of asymmetry into the equation, which I think is something that Hegel is saying happens and is not necessarily a bad thing, is the reemergence of asymmetry and, you know, intrusion, interruption, disruption, whatever. And what he talks about here is the motionless consciousness as kind of the I guess, the engendering of that sublation of self-sublation, because the motionless consciousness is this sort of shape of consciousness here that emerges that would see this this act of speaking and judging and deceit and finding the greatest truth to be the stating of its deceit, and this sort of weird unfolding paradoxical thing. A motionless consciousness would see this as arbitrary deceit with occasional wisdom, because he's just saying shit. He's just saying whatever, kind of. He's just arbitrarily kind of, he tells me, oh, all I know is that I know nothing. And then he comes up to me, he says a bunch of stupid stuff. And then sometimes he'll say something that's kind of okay. And I think that's just because he's throwing spaghetti at the wall. Motionless consciousness is talking about the culturally formed and educated consciousness, this consciousness embedded in deceit, in this weird sort of relationship to deceit, this culturally formed and educated consciousness, which is what, Joey, you were talking about, is that in that conversation is like this, it's this culturally educated but base consciousness. It is where culture forms, but it's this deceit, and motionless consciousness is opposed to it, to maintain this simplicity and motionlessness and this simple consciousness. Sometimes motionless consciousness will demand like individuality in order to dissolve invertedness, because, and this is getting into kind of the mechanisms of what I think this invertedness is. I think that, and this is also the kind of weird thing about the further sublating of these sublations or relations that we're dealing with at the end of this. To maintain simple consciousness, it demands individuality. Where I think that it does this is where he's talking about like nature, you know, and where it's saying like this is why he's saying like it's what a person shouldn't do. It's directly demanding what an individual shouldn't do, which is consider only himself. You know what I mean? He's saying that it's put into this position by motionless consciousness in an effort to maintain simple consciousness that demands individuality. And this, I think, to him would be in places like in this relationship to the absolute through nature or whatever. And what I've heard is, and I've kind of talked about and read about a little bit, is a common idea around Kant and his ethical theory, is that it kind of really focuses on the individual, like super particularly is like your will and this other individual's will, and their interaction as mutually, equally deserving a rightful wills, equally rightful wills. But it orients itself around this like absolute individuality, which dissolves invertedness, is what Hegel says. He says it dissolves the invertedness, because the inverted, which to me, I guess, this is where it's kind of, we have to ask why, I guess. But to me, it's that there's this attempt to dissolve, to like get past that sort of absolute disruption, that state of constant disruption, right? It's an active attempt to get past this constant discord or disjointedness or disjunction between myself and my world, in a sense. And the way that it tries to do this is to simplify the terms that you're working with down to individual, particular, singularly individual terms. And I think that Hegel's just basic critique of that is that the only way to even theoretically do that, to dissolve this invertedness that you want to dissolve so bad, would be for spirit to return to itself as some sort of higher consciousness. And then he goes on and he's like, by the way, it's already done that. He's like, God, the disruption of consciousness that is conscious of itself. He just kind of, I guess, outlines this state of consciousness being this act. Self-consciousness is this act, and the disruption of consciousness is that act that is conscious of itself. You know what I'm saying? And so this self of consciousness, as well as the pure universality of the term consciousness, seem to come together there in this. You know what I mean? And basically, the point I'm making is that, yeah, I do see like a sublation of self-sublation, and that's my sense of what the motionless consciousness is, by the way, and like what it does. But that gets into like witty consciousness, and then he talks about stoicism and faith and all that good stuff.
When you were talking about demand to be an individual, that to me, like, very helped clear up section 523. And I feel like you were almost just walking us through that, at the end of that section where he says, come back around to itself to attain a still higher consciousness. Yeah, I feel like, and what you're saying, like what he's saying is, it seems to me that the motionless consciousness that would demand that of base consciousness doesn't realize that like base consciousness has already like got that, or is like already moved in that direction. I guess to me 305, that's the transition into faith, right? When he starts talking about this like towards heaven, this kind of like otherly world. And then the part about vanity kind of confuses me. I don't really understand how that plugs into like how faith relates to the world. But and maybe another question / comment I had is this the idea that the base consciousness and how it's kind of like abstracting itself from everything, and it like rebels inward in regards to like its need or dependence on like wealth, and like I wonder, or I propose how that's related to like faith, how it kind of constructs this like inner heavenly world. I guess I'm just like really trying to grasp how we move from base consciousness to faith. And I see that happening like on 305 to 306 when he's kind of wrapping up base consciousness.
I wanted to sort of ask if this is what Joy was meaning earlier, kind of in relation to what Hunter was saying about the self-sublation business. So, when Joy was describing what Kalkavage said, So the sense I get, or what I wonder is, there's this stage where consciousness is a willing participant in the formation of culture. I don't know, maybe that's the noble consciousness, but then at some point, and it almost seems like a movement towards cynicism in a way, that the person realizes, like, this is just a bunch of shit we made up. I mean, what's so great about culture and all that? And yet, I mean, this is when you were describing that guy, I've forgotten who the historical character was. And so then you get to the place where you think, yeah, I mean, so what's the big deal about culture? But you still participate in it. And yet you participated in this sort of cynical, distanced kind of way, rather than as a authentically engaged, member of the community that produces and maintains the culture. And so then you kind of become this artificial person that is both. And that's where I say, like, maybe I'm wondering if maybe that's where the self-deception is. It's like this. My son has some friends who are at least self-professed. What are the people that hate government? There you go, anarchist. My wife screams. And so the funny thing is, one of his friends is this really strident anarchist, and she would ride a public bus to attend a protest by anarchists. So she's using a public mode of transportation, riding on public streets that are all funded by taxes and run by the government, in order to go to a rally to protest government. And I don't know that she thought of it in cynical terms, but that's kind of what Joey and Hunter made me think of, is this kind of movement toward this sort of alienated consciousness that is both participating and yet distancing itself from the culture at the same time. And then as Joey says, then I wonder, I mean, I still don't really know. I don't understand what faith is. And so I have that same question Joey has, is how do you move from that into faith? What's the transition? And I still don't really know what he means, and maybe there's a translation issue between German and English, I don't know. But he does associate this with religion, and the word I'm not sure why he would use the word faith, and I guess as you guys were saying earlier, it's because it's associated with the mode of consciousness that's engaged in the otherworldly rather than in the actuality of life, and that's why it's faith, is because it's engaged in something that it doesn't have direct experience of, but can only think of, or I'm not sure. But how do you get, from the previous stage, like Joey said, into this stage? And then again, what exactly is that faith?
That was a big jump for me too, because he seems to say that culture itself is a form of self-alienation through spirit. Because right off the bat in 527, he says the spirit of self-alienation has its existence in the world of culture. And he goes on to talk about, I thought, an interesting concept of picture thoughts, but it almost seems like what he's saying is that faith is kind of like this logos classic understanding of like pure insight, in that once you have this self-alienation from culture, the very fact that you can be self-alienated and try to, through the dialectical process, judge culture, is a form of having faith. And the faith seems to be this almost traditional combination of logos with the dialectical process that requires what he calls pure insight that leads to pure consciousness. So you have to have this essentially a belief that there is something progressing, be it the city of God, be it faith, whatever it is, but it has to combine actuality in essence, or the world and thought in and of itself. And it's only through this pure insight that faith gets its basis. I have so much underlined and wanted to talk about in this section. This was in case of point, this is a lot to go through in 2 hours, even in a reduced amount. I mean, this is an insane amount to talk about. because it goes back to what Hunter was saying, because right at the end of because I wanted to ask about this too, because in 528 he goes into quite a bit about religion and then the process of pure consciousness, which seems to, let me look at my notes here. It's like this combination of a proper understanding of consciousness and self-consciousness through a belief of faith in spirit that lets you develop or continue to have an understanding of its development. And it's like very specific in its happening, the actualization of it that leads to another actualization of it. Because in 530, the part where he says, just as faith and pure insight belong in common to the elements of pure consciousness, so also are they in common the return from the actual world of culture, which again, it seems to be that dialectical relation where it's like you have this understanding of the dialectical process, and then once you have that and it leads to a belief or a faith almost that there's some process going on, it repeats itself ad infinitum. And that's where I was getting like a little confused, a lot confused.
So does he call this religion just because it's trying to deal with some otherworldly? I mean, is that kind of the essence of what he thinks of as religion, is positing an otherworldly? Because he doesn't say a lot about religion. He just says, well, here we're entering the domain of religion, but he doesn't really say why or what that means. But he just keeps talking about faith and the otherworldly. So, and then I wonder, and this is a total guess, that I don't have any text for, so it may be completely wrong. You know, if maybe the transition is that when a person arrives at this state of participating and yet in a sense almost resenting culture, you know, like I'm participating in it, but at the same time, I don't really think it's authentic. And so I kind of resent the fact that this is where my meaning and value are coming from, is participating in this culture. Does that then throw one into the desire to find value and meaning in some otherworldly, because this just isn't doing it anymore, you know? So like if culture is supposed to be the locus and the ground of meaning and value in my life, and then I get to this point where I kind of, you know, I'm kind of alienated from that in some profound way, does that throw me then into this readiness to have faith in some otherworldly domain where I can actually make sense of all this shit, and I can sort of conceptualize and generate and fabricate and, you know, create a world that is more meaningful than this world of actuality that I've become disenchanted by. But that's a lot of guessing, actually.
I kind of have some thoughts on there, and I wanted to say that I kind of think it, and I have a hard time imagining like how would Ramu's nephew, like the exemplar of base consciousness, like transition into faith. And I think, you know, like it's hard to grasp how, like, you know, it would throw like one particular singular individual into the next phase. But I think also like this transition to faith and pure insight is also following, and because I think these are a little bit more like historically trackable, like this section on spirit, you know. So we're going from the Greeks to the Romans, and I think now we're like moving into this like Enlightenment era. So I feel like maybe that makes a little bit of sense to me. It makes some sense of how he gets from this like noble and base consciousness to faith and pure insight, and whereas the next section is labeled the Enlightenment. And I can see like in this era there being like this argument over, you know, faith versus insight. And then like the idea of where he's talking about like how faith is more like representational or picture thinking. And Kalkavage at least like pairs faith up with like the idea of heaven, and kind of like taking the actual world and like just making it more ideal. Whereas faith's like ideal is still like an object. It's still like a world. Whereas like, and so this is so faith is kind of, and I have this written in my notes, like he says this too on page 309, like right in the middle. It's that italicized line. He says, it has in thinking, not in concepts, in pure consciousness, not in pure self-consciousness. So I see like faith is kind of tied to consciousness, where its object is like the actual world, or like, you know, this actual heaven world, where it's like still kind of like what it thinks of as an object. Whereas insight, pure insight, is like this thinking in terms of concepts, where it's just like process and movement, and it's more like I guess to me, like pure insight seems more along the lines of like the base consciousness, where it can like show how everything like shifts and changes into itself. Whereas faith wants to think, and also what you were saying earlier, Nevid, about like how does base consciousness like shift into faith? And I think it does make sense, where like if you've lost all hope in this cultured world and you feel like you're just living this kind of like inauthentic existence, that like the next step for this universal individual would be to like think about like some sort of, you know, afterworld that's going to be like reached, where like, oh, this will all the contradictions will be solved, all this is going to go away. At least like that's kind of how I was like reading faith, as like looking to this like this object. And then I also found this really interesting part too when he's talking on 310. And so I like wouldn't have picked this up at all if Kalkovage hadn't kind of like paired it. But when he's talking about like the on page 310, he's talking about these enduring spirits, the essences existing in and for themselves, enduring spirits, at one with themselves in their own sphere. And then he says, it is thus only for us, so like, you know, the philosophers or the readers, Hegel, that the movement of their transition is an alienation of the determinateness in which they are in their differences. And it is only for us that it is a necessary series. However, for faith, their difference is a motionless diversity, and their movement is an event. This, I think Kalkovage pairs this to the Trinity and like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, whereas like the pure insight person wants to like see these as concepts that are shifting into each other through this like logical development, which I feel like is like the entire dialectic for Hegel. Whereas like for faith, it's just like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, you know, there's not like a, like, you know, this interaction between them. It's just a kind of like what I would, you know, I put like miracle here. Like when he put event, I do kind of like wonder exactly what he means by event. It's just like something that happens. But yeah, I mean, I do want to like just second what Joseph said. I feel like this section was dense, and I came excited to almost just like walk through it.
I feel like we're just going to scratch the surface with this. Yeah, and I like how Kalkovich and page 290 said that faith and insight are two complementary sides of universality, in culture in its mode as inward thought or reflection. And he says that in some, faith corresponds to consciousness and insight to self-consciousness. So in its reduction of everything to the process of selfhood, insight turns towards the stable objects of faith. It seeks to destabilize the believer's peace of mind to replace the rest of faith with the motion of purely conceptual thinking. So like desire, insight negates everything objective, which I would never have thought of without Kalkovich bringing that up. But I thought that was a really interesting combination of how faith and insight correspond to consciousness and self-consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to point out, like on page 309, where he says that, and because that sentence to me was so confusing. But
When you
like
say 309, do you mean Kalkovich or Hegel?
Oh, Hegel's page
Sorry.
309, where that sentence that was just like, however, it has it in thinking, not in concepts, in pure consciousness, not in first. I was like if I would have, I feel like that sentence to me, I'm just like, what is happening? And it's like not even a long sentence, right? I don't know if I'm the only one that struggled with that one, but
God, no.
and then I did like how he, and you know, because he says immediately after that sentence, he says the immediacy with which the essence lies within faith has to do with its object being essence, which is to say pure thinking. So I think it was kind of contra to this idea that like faith isn't thinking. And I know maybe I'm like, you know, just taking faith as he's saying it and thinking of it how we might normally think of it. But it was just interesting how he paired faith. Faith is still this like form of thinking. And I think that's where he will get to. And I don't think we've gotten there yet, but how like faith and insight do end up like, you know, being more alike than they would like to think. and that like both of them are thinking, and I think both of them are serving maybe a similar role in terms of the actual world, and that they're both kind of negating the actual world. Just faith is kind of positing this like positive object, which is kind of how he distinguishes it from Stoicism. You've got faith has just like, you know, what I was reading is like this like heavenly realm that's still kind of like tied to the actual, and still gives faith like a picture in its mind of like what it would like. Whereas Stoicism and skepticism were just kind of like abstract, empty. And then I think that's what he wants to say pure insight is guilty of too, that it's just form, like it's just absolute negation. It's just movement, right? It just wants to destabilize everything. And I feel like I haven't gotten any like direct references from Hegel, but I can see where he's like showing how like we lead up to nihilism, which is what Kalkovich says is like the kind of like downfall of culture, of this culture phase. Because I can see like how this like be rational could lead to like nihilism, or even I felt like I got glimpses of that from the base consciousness and his like wittiness.
I like how you said that, how like faith corresponding to consciousness with the help of what Kalkovich said, and insight being self-conscious, that war, like one thinks it's better than the other, but it's really the dialectical process of one trying to negate the other, that happening between the two, that is the focus, and how I think he tries to, or at least Hegel tries to, make faith a component of reason through the dialectical process of that constant negation of the two sides.
Oh, maybe I went to get more alcohol because, you know, Hegel, and I wonder if you know, one of the things I wonder that maybe you guys already talked about is what does he mean by thinking that is not representational? Because he, you know, like you get, like Joey was saying, and he says it's like faith. How does he put it? Faith. Let's see. The essence of faith descends from thought all the way down into representational thought. That's in section 528. And so, you know, I wonder what is thought without representational thinking. And I don't know, but I'm wondering, you know, Jackson and I had a conversation yesterday, I think, and we were talking about, 2 days ago, 3 days ago. Anyway, Monday, I guess it was Monday. Anyway, we had this conversation, and one of the things we're talking about is the role of experience versus thinking in religion. And you know, I used to belong to some Christian contemplative groups years ago, and part of the reason was because it seemed to me that religion without experience is just dry and pointless. It's just another intellectual exercise. And in my experience of much of Protestant religion is like that. It's just thinking, you know, and the sermons are theological analysis and all this. And so I was wondering, you know, what the I don't know if I want to say the essence, the blood of religious experience or of religion is experience. And I don't know if that's what he's pointing to, but I at least wonder, because like you guys are pointing at, you know, he's like, well, we could just reduce all this to reason, but is that really such a great idea? And so I wonder, I don't know. I mean, this is speculation on my part, but this stuff about thinking prior to representational thought, I don't even know what that means, but is it like some kind of, you know, is faith a mode of consciousness that is sort of pre-representational? I don't know. Again, I don't know what that means, but that's what I'm wondering.
When I was reading like faith as representational thought, I feel like it's below kind of conceptual thought, below it's like representational thought is pre-conceptual thought. Is that related to your question?
I don't know what the relationship between conceptual thought and representational thought. I mean, when I think of representational thought, I think of picture thinking, not like literally I'm looking around at the world and, and I'm seeing images of things. On the other hand, my ability to encounter the world as representations, I think, is fundamentally conditioned by conceptuality. I mean, I think that's one of Kant's insights, is that, you have to have a conceptual framework in order to be able to experience the world representationally. And so I don't know. I don't know if he's drawing a distinction there. I mean, I just really don't know. But so maybe I'm wrong. I was thinking that this thinking prior to representational thought is, I don't know what its relationship to conceptual thinking is. I mean, it's hard for me to say that there is a thinking that is not conceptual. And I guess I'm wondering, is that, so there's a good question, is Hegel saying that there is a mode of thinking that is not conceptual? And what does that mean? I mean, is that just non-conceptual experience? And I don't even know what that would be. So I don't know what non-representational, I mean, I can think of non-representational thinking in the sense of if I'm doing logic or mathematics, if I like modus ponens. On the other hand, when I say modus ponens, this little picture pops in my mind of a P and an arrow and a Q and a P and a Q. So I don't know.
For what, I mean, yeah, I wanted to underscore what you said, I can't imagine representational thought without having some kind of conceptual framework to hang it on, and maybe that's Kant. Maybe Kant did that to me. But when you're kind of interrogating the possibility of non-conceptual thought, and then you kind of slipped into phrasing it as non-conceptual experience. And here, I just wanted to, this is an Adornian theme right here. Adorno explores the possibility of non-conceptual experience, but he explicitly denies the possibility of non-conceptual thought, right? So if concepts are necessary for thinking. However, he wants to say that almost in it's almost like an ersatz substitute for Kant's noumenon, right? He's also trying to posit something beyond beyond thought, which is constitutive of the world, and this he calls non-conceptual experience, but explicitly not something that you can think. So somewhat like the noumenon. It's yeah, Adorno's non-conceptual experience kind of reflects, is like the noumenon in important respects, but radically different from the thing in itself or the noumenon in other important respects.
So, one question I have about Hegel is when he uses the word thought and consciousness, is consciousness always involved with thought? I mean, I can't find the paragraph, but there's some place where he says something about consciousness. I thought consciousness without thought or something like that, but I'm not sure. So I'm just wondering what does he mean by thought? What does he mean by thinking? And is there non-thinking consciousness for Hegel? Is there non-conceptual consciousness? I just don't know.
Yeah, I think when I said that, I realized that maybe I was just kind of getting bogged down in like exactly that just like, what does Hegel really mean when he's saying thinking? And then maybe when I said that about representational thought and conceptual thought, I guess I was pairing it with like the way he contrasts insight with pure faith, and thinking about how or pure insight with faith, and how insight is kind of like thinking, maybe like thinking according to the concept, whereas like faith is, and like I'm reading this sentence here, faith is thereby indeed pure consciousness of the essence, which is to say of simple inwardness, and is therefore thinking, the chief moment in the nature of faith, which is usually overlooked. I'm like calling to mind that maybe he says something like, while faith is consciousness of the essence, it doesn't recognize the essence as essence, which like I read is it doesn't recognize itself as thinking. It recognizes itself as like positing an object, like another realm, this otherworldly realm. Whereas I think pure insight is self-conscious. It recognizes what it's doing in this negation of the world, is not creating another positive world, but is like thinking through, and I don't know if I want to say the world, because I think it's also supposedly like opposed to the world, but it's thinking. It's like kind of pure form, and it's just like it has itself as its only object. And I think this takes the form of it just like negating, destabilizing.
I put the part in the chat, Joey, that I think what you were talking about, where Kalkovich was talking about that in 290, which I found extremely helpful.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, because I do imagine almost just this like and I don't know, with Nevitt, the way you describe your like transition, you know, with your life of like being kind of like more religiously fundamentalist and kind of like coming to philosophy or whatever that looked like for you, and then just having this like rage against the just like I just want to like be rational, and just like I imagine this pure insight person just like with this fever to just go destabilize their peace of mind. And I mean, like, you know, I see, like, you know, I guess we haven't gotten there, but I think Hegel's hinted at it, and Kalkovich will say this leads to disaster of some sort.
Yeah, it can lead to nihilism, which is something Nietzsche is also worried about. Chase is all for that, you know. Anyway, Chase and I are on the same page there. God sucks. Nihilism's great.
Katrina, what's your puppy's name? I'm sorry to deviate too much.
It's Katerina, and my dog's name is
Katerina.
Penny. Sorry, we usually go for a walk around this time, so she like starts getting antsy and like paces around me.
Pets are always welcome.
We like animals. The reason I show my cat tree over here is because there's usually one up there, but there's nobody there now.
Yeah, we don't have Sammy or Dean here today. We don't have Coco. Oh well.
Yeah, Coco's I'd say
Coco is my favorite. Oh my gosh, I love her.
Yeah, Coco's great. I mean,
She's
She's my
such a
favorite
diva.
too.
Yay! There you are, Travis.
Is that Travis's cat?
Yes, he's there. We're talking about you. I love
I
when
think
she's
we
such a diva.
should.
She just lays out and is like, "I'm done," and then goes.
Yeah, I
I
relate to
kind of want
Coco a
to
lot.
catnap Coco. I don't know if Shinobi will like that, but whatever, you can deal with it. But yeah, I want to be Travis petting Coco. That's just it's so pure and innocent.
It's pretty
I just
great.
love it. Yeah, I think because I'm so impure and degenerate.
You're
that
going
it's
back
just
into the good, bad, base
nice, you know?
consciousness thing here, man.
That reminds me,
Nice.
Chase, of the practices of Pliny the Elder, right? That old Roman medical doctor, right? Who thought to cure jaundice, you just needed to look a canary, you know, who's yellow, and just watch it die, and then you're solved.
Interesting cure there. Yeah.
Pretty foul.
So
I did want to add something because I'm going to have to go out shortly. But Saturday, we're planning right now for a movie night, and maybe we'll make this into a regular thing. So there's a form in the Discord under the movies channel. So if you haven't voted yet, go ahead and do that. Also, nothing. I lied. That's it. Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it greatly. I can't wait until we have absolute knowledge and everything is good and pure, and then I don't have to think again. Goodbye.
I think that's exactly how it works.
Oh, did he sign off? Wow, that's a hell of an exit.
you have a black cat named Snowy?
No, Shinobi.
Shinobi. Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to accuse you
spell
of
it here.
extremely Hegelian by naming a black cat Snowy, but
Although, okay, I had a stuffed animal when I was a kid of a snow leopard that was named Snowy, and it was my favorite. And I think the whole taxonomy of the big cats. I was a stuffed animal and big cat enthusiast, and Snowy was my favorite. So I think you picked up on something there. Maybe I can relate that to Hegel. I don't know. I'm not even going to try. So probably not. Yeah.
You have a big cat themed tiger blanket for your bed, like 3/4 of my Mexican family.
Yeah, definitely. So I had a room that was painted and decorated like a jungle and I think I had some curtains or bed sheets, or I had something like that too. Yeah. I think I was like 8 or something. I don't know. It was pretty cool. Yeah. Not gonna lie. I've had a privileged life. My snowy and everything, you know. But look what happened. Look what I turned into. All for nothing.
Don't be self-negative. We love you.
Yeah, I'm just joking. I'm awesome. I mean, yeah.
You can't, like
All
what?
right, I'm muting my microphone and probably I think I have to go soon anyways. Yeah.
I'll go way, 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 way dark here. So is the ultimate Hegelian act suicide? I'm sorry. That was a really, really bad dark joke. You know, so utter and complete self-negation.
Well, yeah, I get I get that. I think that at the very least, you know, it's like I think Hegel would laugh too. He'd be like, yeah, can you believe how fucked all this is? Yeah, if you wanted to be really ethical, you know how shitty that is like an option. It's like every ethical edifice that could possibly exist is oriented around the fact that at least 2 people agreed on that ethics, which is why it's an ethic, which means that it runs the risk of encountering another different ethic that is different from it. And the 2 cannot be adhered to simultaneously by some condition that's possible. And then the highest possible ethical act that can exist within that ethical edifice is to sacrifice myself for the sake of its existence, for its actualization, which means that like the highest ethical act possible is to kill that guy over there who's saying all that bullshit. Who's saying that thing he's saying over there. I need to go kill that guy, and then die in the process. But not in like a Hegel is saying you should do this. Not at all. But like the point is, it's just a fun illustration of the idea that there's a barbarism at the core of any civilized structure. In any ethical edifice, there's some sort of barbarism, which is just more sort of coincidence of opposites, which is, par for the course.
In other words, Hegel would say suicide is okay if you find yourself in a situation similar to Antigone.
Here's my hot take that I'm going to sign off with. I think suicide is the ultimate act of Deleuzian philosophy. And that would put the Hegelian aspect in an interesting contention with it. I was just about to pretend to say something intelligent to try to spin that around, but I think I'm just going to not do that.
I'm returning to something that we looked at earlier. I mean, like Joseph was saying, we haven't got anywhere close to exhausting this last part, but I just, because I can't think of anything to say at the moment about that. The first sentence in section 520 is the spirit is the absolute and universal inversion and alienation of actuality and of thought. It is pure cultural formation. I don't have any idea why that is pure cultural formation, but I guess the question that occurred to me earlier when I was asking Hunter, what inversion is. I mean, is inversion just another way of expressing negation? I mean, is that all that is? You know, that like like we've talked about before, if the dialectic is an internal process where whatever is naturally, or whatever the opposite of something naturally emerges from it itself, and then sublates that first moment, and then the opposite of that naturally emerges from it. Is that just another, is inversion just another description of that? In other words, is inversion just another word basically to express dialectic? Why are you laughing at me? Or is Travis sending you private jokes again?
Travis corrected my spelling on the word Q, and I realized that it's supposed to be C-U-E. All right, like this, apparently. Wait, no, is it? Whatever.
It depends on how you use it from a technical standpoint.
I didn't want to
said-
embarrass him in
Right.
front of everyone.
Well, I said that
okay?
was Chase's cue to leave. By the way, no, don't worry.
Oh,
I-
okay, then yeah, Travis is right. Well, he was being nice, but
Yeah, and I found it funny, and then I got in trouble. All right.
No
and-
smiling during Hegel
Yes.
seminars.
Yeah,
Hunter.
no
That's
smile.
true. That is true. I just wanted to say that I don't know if I could say that inversion and negation are identical terms. You know what I mean? I don't know if I would say that. Yeah, but because it's similar to like the difference between these, like the discussion that Eric and I had however long ago about the difference between difference and negativity. You know what I mean? With the differences between things and the negations of things, and like the kind of way that they intertwine and the way that they separate at certain points. But I feel like inversion, actually, yeah, Joseph raises a good idea. Wouldn't inversion be a property of force rather than negation? I guess, yes. I think that in a sense, the notion of inversion rather than just negation would come from that section on cultural formation, actually. Yeah, the part that Joey was talking about with the language of disruption, and the input of a living disruption, you know, consciousness. In fact, actually, right before that, on like page 301, here, yeah, on page 301. It's not anything I necessarily need to quote directly, but just to orient yourself. Yeah, so sections 518 and 519 again. Consciousness is absolute disruption, but then finds spirits that are in communication can affirm and recognize each other as absolute disruptions, which then can bring about this language of disruption or whatever. But he lays out there like consciousness is this, like, therefore, while the circumstances of this consciousness are bound up with this absolute disruption, the difference within its spirit, which is a difference determined as the opposition between the noble consciousness and the base consciousness, itself falls by the wayside, and both are the same. And so it's saying that, like, there's this, and I don't know what it's saying. I don't know what he's saying, frankly. But what my brain tells me it's saying, in order for it to not just resist me, you know, and I guess this is my brain's like my mind's hypothesis, my hypothesis as to what it's saying, is that consciousness is bound up, or the circumstances of this consciousness is bound up with this absolute disruption. And the notion of base and noble consciousness, the difference between them ceases to be like this essential difference, at the very least, you know, this necessary difference between the two terms, but is more so this inessential difference, or this difference that is, and he said this before so many times, a difference that has no difference at all. Whatever. My point is, consciousness is this absolute disruption. No, it is, but well, he said that before in certain places. He said that it's negativity, but he said that it's bound up with this absolute disruption. And I think that its inverting of things is very directly, both just as a term, I guess, as we can tell just from an everyday standpoint, and from the way that it's been playing out. I think it is very much to deal with like the direct opposite of the thing, in the sense that I think that this gets back into the difference versus the negated versus the inverted form of something. And I think that what I think would be the most like the most basic way that my mind kind of makes sense of it is that things are inverted, or you can say that things are inverted when they are taking place in a consistent like battlefield. And that battlefield is the inside of pure consciousness, right? And I think this is actually a point that Eric, you were making earlier, is that it's like, there's this split between pure insight and faith in pure consciousness, of course. Very like, gotta remember where we are and what we're dealing with, this consciousness bound up with the absolute disruption or whatever. And if they're in this sort of common ground of pure consciousness, and we can see their opposition and then their not destruction or mutual disillusion, like they don't cancel each other out and kill each other or negate each other, you know what I mean? Annihilate their effects, but they invert and fall into one another in a way where their difference seems to dissolve. And that's where I think the consciousness of inversion is coming from. And that's what I think inversion is, but I don't know.
I was looking at that quotation I just read from the beginning of 520. The inversion and alienation of actuality and thought. So I guess, so maybe the point would be that actuality and thought are inversions, but they're not necessarily, neither one is the dialectical negation of the other. So inversion, I mean, interestingly, Nietzsche calls the idea of the afterworld, he calls it an inverted world. I mean, this passage makes me wonder if he's actually quoting Hegel there. But I could see, if that's what you mean, I could see that where actuality and thought are not really a dialectical relationship where one's emerging from and sublating the other, but they just sort of stand as sort of ontological opposites of one another.
I was gonna say, I think inversion is a form of negativity, but it's not, it's much more specific, we have a whole bunch of different senses of negation and negativity in Hegel. Early on in the logic, negativity is really kind of where being stops, or positive being stops. If you talk any object and its positive being, there's a point after which it stops, and everything beyond that is the negativity of the primary being. So in some sense, that kind of resembles what Hunter was alluding to earlier with this, kind of almost equating it with difference, but it's not quite there yet. It's not just a matter of being other than, but other than, and in a way that prohibits the positive being of it, right? And then we have determinate negation. We have determinate negation, which is almost like an imminent opposite of, right? So black would be the determinate negation of white. Now we have a much more specific form of negation. And then I want to say inversion involves a compound, like whatever element you're inverting, it has to already be a compound of some sort. It must be made of more than one element, because what we're doing is we're applying determinate negations to specific elements, or we're taking the same elements and putting them in the reverse order, right? But I want to say for inversion to take place, what has to be inverted already has to be a compound in some sense. Whereas with negation and determinate negation, you can negate, a simple object, or, you know what I mean? Or talk about the determinate negation of a relatively simple object, right? An element or what have you. I don't know if that helps.
I just want to say I agree.
Is that an
Faith.
Adorno thing, or is that, no? Okay.
No,
Just
this is me trying to make sense of the Hegelian terms. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that negativity in Hegel is a huge concept that has many different kind of manifestations and implications and uses, right? And so you have to look at it more specifically. And then he takes that, like I said, takes negativity, and then he often uses the phrase determinate negation. And there's a reason why he calls it determinate negation rather than just negation, right? And so again, I think inversion is a form. It can be a form, of, again, the dialectic, again, something positing itself outside of itself in another form, which confronts itself and causes a change. And that first, that first movement can be one of inverting, right? And which, go ahead.
Didn't he call that form of inverting where you confuse just the negation for determinate negation as the underworld? Like it's there when he talked about force, it's just there to negate. That negation is itself a form of determinate negation. Like the inverted world is just there to show an opposite, and is able to transport that through force, is what I thought. Does that go along with what you're saying, Eric?
Death would be the ultimate determinate negation of life, right? But all we have in our experience is life to speak of, right? So what we think and know of death, right, is only by process of inverting or by a process of applying a determinate negation to our concept of life. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a little after 7. Bye-bye, Katerina.
We love your puppy and your company. Thank you for joining us.
We'll keep you in the email. She's gone. So most people are gone. Joseph raised the possibility of having an additional meeting. Is anyone up for that? Should I just post to make a poll or something?
I mean, I don't know. I just feel like 2 hours is such a. I have so many other things that would. Yeah, I don't know. It might not be feasible, but there's just a lot to talk about. So.
Might use the Discord for a more just a space to carry conversations forward without having any kind of time constraints, because
Yeah.
you might find it difficult to find a meeting time where we can all meet midweek, but you might be able to pose a question, Joseph, on the Discord, and that, between now and next time we meet and discuss Hegel will have been discussed by 2 or 3 people.
I posted questions on Discord under the Hegel something or other. I've sometimes directed them directly to Hunter, and usually he responds to those eventually, though sometimes not. But I'm looking on Discord to seeing what, I think it's just under summer seminar.
Yeah, it's under summer. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Eric, is your dog's name Nietzsche? Did I read that correct?
Right.
Yay! I love all the dogs here. I love the animals. That's like the best part outside of the philosophy of the company, is seeing the animals.
When we first had to go all online because of the COVID thing after spring break, a little over a year ago, students, I would have my cat occasionally wander through, and so students started showing rabbits and cats and dogs. It was kind of fun. It was a way of sort of making it a little more homey.
That's awesome.
Okay, well, we'll hopefully see you Monday then.
Alrighty, take care, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.